Welcome back to From Pain to Gain. We have a special episode here, again with Jason Montoya, my good brother. Right here, man. Right here, bro. We're always on such a same page, so I had to bring him along. Today we're talking about the Beatitude bar as it relates to the presidential candidates. So we're going to go through Kamala Harris and Donald Trump as they relate to the Beatitudes in the Bible. So before we get started, I wanted to do a quick intro with Jason. Well, first, could you introduce yourself for people that don't know you?
Yeah. So I'm Jason Montoya. I'm here in Atlanta with Ivan. We met here in the city many years ago. I had a marketing company that we got connected with. I had since shut it down and been a freelancer since 2014. Written some books on the topic of freelancing, small business, but I also write on topics of Christian faith and societal political issues, as well as a podcast that I have called Share Life.
Yeah, you have a lot of great, amazing guests, especially authors on there too.
Yes.
Make sure to check out his podcast. For me, I'm a real estate investor. I've been doing it over 17 years at this point. And so I'm also author, podcaster, etc. But I don't want to talk about myself too much. Let's jump into this intro, man, because this stuff really hurts my spirit, my body. Like when sometimes I'm out in the world and I can just literally feel the pain in my spirit, like of everybody's going through something, right?
Yeah.
I think of it like the gnashing of teeth, like we hear in the Bible, because there's a lot of loss that is going down right now. I know there's got to be some family, friend loss. There's if you're going to even as simple as Thanksgiving in a few months.
Yeah.
You might be afraid of having a political conversation. It's anxiety because you might lose a family relationship that you loved so much for decades.
Yeah. Because
of this sort of conversation, and not being able to look somebody in the eye because of that situation.
Yeah.
And so that's not a natural thing. It's a painful thing. Speaking of groups, you could even lose your job if you don't follow the fold of following a certain candidate. You might be, as you mentioned before, alienated out of a certain group, or fear of loss of being in a certain group. I was even personally in a business relationship where somebody was a part of another political faction, and for years we were able to stem it, but towards the end it really got to be a problem.
Yeah.
So Jason, what are your thoughts on that, kind of why we're doing this?
Yeah, so I think ultimately it's important that we look through the issue of politics in our society through the lens of our Christian faith. And that's first and foremost through what Christ did on the cross. And so the Beatitudes are, the way I see it, they're God's vision for us when He's doing His work in us. It's the fruit of His work in us. And so we have to be careful they are an ideal that is actually quite impossible and potentially demoralizing to try and strive for on our own, but with the Spirit of God, are evidence that He's actually working out in us that salvation and sanctification or character building. And so looking through the Beatitudes, through the cross, I think is a helpful way to frame it, so that we make sure we're thinking about the Beatitudes in the correct way. Ultimately, when it comes to politics in this conversations that we're having, I think there are ways that we can help alleviate that anxiety by understanding that we are social creatures and that we take a lot of cues from our community and our groups, and so we're not as reasonable and logical as we might hope or think that we are. We can be a lot more emotional about things or social about things, and so that's helpful to understand just how we go about thinking about some of these issues. And then, but at the end of the day, we're going to arrive at we're going to have relationships where we arrive at a point where there's an irretractable conflict, where you want to vote for this person, I want to vote for this person, or I think you're wrong, or there's something flawed in you because of your decision to support this initiative or this campaign or this person, and you might think the same thing about me. And so at the end of the day, we might not be able to persuade each other or convince each other for a variety of reasons, But at the end of the day, how are we going to respond when I have that friendship or that family member who isn't going to change their mind, and I'm not going to change their mind? How am I going to respond? And we can choose to respond in love and still maintain accountability, or we can respond with domination and contempt. And so when we can't change things, I just know for myself as a recovering control freak, when I can't control something, it frustrates me, and when I'm frustrated, I want to take more control. And so the Beatitudes are saying, actually, if you let God work that out in you, then He'll transform that frustration into something good. And then when those moments happen, you can actually be a light to those people. So those are a few things that I think at the end of the day, a lot of this comes down to how am I conducting myself. And if I can't conduct myself in a Christ-like way, then I may be in over my head. I may have bit off more than I can chew, and I need to maybe pull back and let God work out in me in a smaller context. And then, if it makes sense, go back into a larger one. So, does that make sense?
For sure. And it brings me to the goals of this, which is to add perspective.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you're caught up in an emotional state and acting out, I can relate to being a control freak too. And even being able to act out in different ways to try to get control and that are ineffective. Mm-hmm. So adding perspective helps with that in a calm way, especially in these sort of tense conversations. But so that's one main goal.
And I think just one thing to add to that is it's a mutual thing. So if the two people are having a conversation, it's both people can choose to add that perspective to themselves, and in a transformative way, not just in a knowledge way, like I've learned more, but actually, how are you seeing this? How am I seeing this? And I think adding that, I think when we let go of the idea that I have to change you or change how you're seeing things, all I'm doing is my part, which is I'm sharing my point of view. I'm listening to you. If we just accept our limited role, and this kind of gets to the first Beatitude, which is the poor in spirit, my poverty, like how little I can control, how little I can affect other people, then it's a lot that anxiety can start to shift away.
Yeah. There's a good quote that our friend Matt said the other day. He said, I always assume that the other person knows more than I do.
Yeah, that's a good assumption.
Yeah. Shout out to Matt.
They have something to teach us. I think that's a helpful thing, is to try and work out if we feel any sense of superiority to another person, to have that type of mindset that says, okay, maybe they know something I don't. Maybe I have something that I can learn from them.
Yeah. Even
if it's so different from where I'm coming from.
Yeah, especially because it's anti-Christian to think, above and beyond.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the reason why we're doing this stuff. And let's jump into the first Beatitude. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So to give a quick little description, the poor in spirit, to be poor in spirit, is to admit their own utter spiritual destitution. They must be broken and contrite over the realization that they possess absolutely nothing to commend themselves to the Father and have no right to His kingdom. So, as we meditate on that and the description of that, I guess, what are your opposite words that you...
Yeah, so poor in spirit, those poor in spirit, blessed are the poor in spirit, for they will receive the kingdom of God. So, one, I think understanding our poverty, and I think the way to really lean in is, again, to look through the cross. So, why did Jesus have to come to the cross to save us? Well, it's because of our sin, which is living our lives without God. It's living them apart from Him and apart from His ways. And so through that decision, we begin to corrupt spiritually. And so we have to understand that spiritually we're impoverished before we can recognize, that we need help. As Jesus came for the sick, not for the healthy. So the poor in spirit, the opposite of that in my mind, wealthy and rich is sort of one word, but you could also use the word entitled or superiority, having a sense of self-righteousness, superiority, that I'm essentially an ignorance or a denial of my poverty, my spiritual poverty, and saying, well, I'm not impoverished. But what Jesus is saying is that those that God is working in, that recognize their poverty, He's going to give them the kingdom of God. And so if we, through our pride, reject that or resist it, then we're never going to receive our inheritance.
Yeah. Man, there's so much there. So I guess we could go ahead and just jump into, well, before I do want to draw an analogy here. So many people relate Christianity to a marathon. And so as it relates to this Beatitude, if you haven't run for 20 years in your life and you want to just jump right in, you're going to get injured, you're going to get hurt. And, and many times right now I see people that don't see God as getting injured, getting hurt, because they don't have something to hold on to. But to bring it back to the Beatitude, if you can't acknowledge that you are severely under-equipped for this work, whatever it is, if you can't acknowledge you're poor for this marathon, then you can't even start the marathon without getting injured and severely injured. So I think that's super key, why it's intentionally put first by Jesus in this example. Like, you have to have an inventory of your life first and how far down you are.
Low on the totem pole.
Yeah.
The status hierarchy.
Yeah, so that you could start from there on your marathon, start the race. Okay, so let's think of recent examples of how Kamala versus Donald relate to this poverty of spirit.
So I have an example. I have a recent example that about both of them that I think applies. But before I do that, I want to just talk just a couple examples of Trump, because when I was thinking about this, when I think about poor in spirit and I think about Trump, I usually don't think about poor in spirit. But I was trying to think about, if I could think about it, what would they be? And so I did have two examples that I think were as close as I could possibly think. So if you think about one end of the spectrum as poor in spirit, and the other is superior and has no humility, prideful. So let's kind of take this. So we can take these candidates and look at them and which one is closer to the other as a pattern across their life, but also in certain events. So for two particular events where Trump was closer to the poor in spirit side of things, the first was after in the 2016 election, before the election, it was a few weeks before the locker room tape came out, which had him joking about sexually assaulting a woman. And so he came out with a video and he had an apology, and he acknowledged it and apologized, and then he kind of said some other. At the time, from what I remember, when I actually heard about that and his response, it was like kind of a moment of, wow, Trump just seems so blusterous and so prideful, and all of a sudden he's kind of, for a moment, kind of recognizing that he did something wrong. It was one of the few times that I had ever noticed that, even to this day. So that was one time, and the second was after he won the election, his presidential acceptance speech. He just had a sense of, I think in some ways, surprise, like, wow, I can't believe I won. But a sense of gravity to the situation, and maybe this is bigger than, it was bigger than he could. And so those would be just the two examples I can think of where he was closest to that. I don't know if there's any others that you would add to that, or anything you've experienced, but kind of going through my mental encyclopedia, that's where I pulled out.
Weren't we talking about one example where he was being interviewed before? I'm trying to remember what it was. By Frank.
Oh, okay. So on the flip side, in terms of the opposite of this poor in spirit, one of the examples, I mean, you could kind of, I guess, give it a mix, but Frank Luntz is interviewing him. I don't remember what year this was, but I can't remember if he was president or not yet. But anyways, he interviewed him and asked him, have you ever asked God for forgiveness? And he says, no, I don't think that I have. And he kind of goes on to talk about how, if he does something, he tries to make things right and doesn't involve God into it.
More willpower based.
Yeah, willpower based, I guess. And that he did take communion. I kind of saw that as more of like, well, I don't need God in this. I can do it on my own, was sort of one of my takeaways, which I think is the opposite of the poor in the Spirit, because the poor in the Spirit is saying, I can't do it on my own. Like, otherwise Christ didn't have to he didn't have to die on the cross if I could do it on my own.
Yeah.
And so that's...
along those lines, I would also add that what's been particularly upsetting to me is the disenfranchising of voters. And so, as you already know, he recently came to Atlanta and was celebrating these new state elected officials that are putting laws in place to not certify the election results, even though it's not their job to even have a decision in the matter. And so celebrating how votes could be put at risk is not a I'm poor in spirit type. It's almost a celebration of crushing people. And, his own means. Yeah,
just a few days ago, maybe it was yesterday, he came out and said if Jesus were counting the votes in California, he would win the vote in California. And so his implication is that the votes in California are fraudulent, and it's a pride thing of there's no way I could lose. There's no way I could lose. And so he can't believe that, and so he tells these lies. And so I think, that's sort of this idea of the poor in spirit would go, you know what, I could lose. I could be wrong. I am, and this is a Christian idea, which is we are sinful and we are self-deceived. And so we have to acknowledge that possibility in the reality. And in that situation, Trump was doing the opposite, and the one you gave, the one about California, where he's essentially claiming he's infallible, and if something goes wrong, it's not his fallibility, it's somebody else's fallibility.
I want to take a detour into your own personal story. You mentioned a quote. I'm going to try to remember it. It's easier to follow somebody strong and flawed versus somebody weak.
Yeah, so there's a famous quote from Bill Clinton, ironically, who said, people tend to prefer strong and wrong to weak and right. And what he's saying is, and this is kind of my own experience, is when I moved to Atlanta in 2005, I left everyone I knew, I left all my community, and I got thrown into the sort of the jungle of life, the reality. And I didn't know what I was doing. I was in over my head, and I essentially got connected with some toxic mentors. And I accepted and tolerated some of that toxicity because it gave me a sense of security. It was because I wanted the strong and wrong, because some of the people, they were so confident and bold about what they said that it's like, how could they be wrong? They're so confident. And I'm the kind of person where, like, I'll be confident from a foundation of truth, but if it's not true, then I won't be confident. And so I kind of overlaid that in these people, was like, well, if they're confident, then it must mean that they're confident because it's based in truth. But the reality is it was based in a lie. And so I was naive in these people. So that was an experience to teach me my own poverty. Like, hey, I could be hoodwinked, I could be conned, I could be manipulated, and I can also be those things. I can be the perpetrator and the victim, and that allows me to go, wow, I really need God's help, because on my own, as confident as I think I am, I really have no clue what I'm doing.
To address that, I am not what I'm doing too, especially in America, where it's like, I'm gonna be a billionaire all on my own. There's many rap songs even. I did it all on my own. I made it. So I can even relate to what you're talking about too. I had a business partnership, and to a large extent, I made this kind of, well, maybe not a large extent, I made this cycle in my head of, well, he's the salesman, he brings in revenues, and I largely just manage everything.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a good compliment.
Yeah.
And so him bringing in the money, I could, like many other people in the world, justify,
Yep.
I'm going to carry this as long as possible.
Yep. Tolerate the bad behavior and lies.
Yeah. Even though after him, and even if he took a hiatus from the company, I could do my own sales and bring in like 50 grand a month. It was just a set thing, and also kind of a passive thing for me too.
Yeah.
Like I could do more of what I want to do if he's doing kind of the brunt of the work.
Mm-hmm.
And so, these sorts of stories I think are going to replicate more and more, like justifying being with somebody, being in partnership with somebody because of financial benefit, but it's not true.
Yeah.
If you do the work, you can figure it out on your own. Makes me even think of a bigger scenario where that happened. Enron.
Yeah.
All these people in the executive level were just kind of feeding and not saying the reality because, well, can't bite the hand that feeds, right?
And that's part of the reason why our faith is so important is because our identity and God's provision is in our trust in Him. Mm-hmm. And as soon as we put our trust in my employer, my company, my shareholders, my whoever, then I'm beholden to them. And if they start taking me down a corrupt moral path, I have no choice but to go along with that.
Yeah.
And I begin to justify worse and worse things, and I tolerate worse and worse things.
Yeah.
And I had an experience with, when I had my marketing company, we had a client, and we had an issue with one of the clients, and I got to this point where I mentally had nothing, I sort of mentally chose that I had nothing to lose. Mm-hmm. That we were going to do the right thing and say the truth, even though it could cost us this client, because that was more important than the client or the money the client brought. And I've had to learn that lesson over and over and practice it. That's the other thing is we can know the right thing to do and know what's true, but if we aren't practicing, when those situations happen, we won't be prepared. You use the muscles you practice with. So
yeah.
The spiritual muscles, character muscles, whatever they are.
And it is scary.
Yeah.
But at least have a little comfort and know you're not the first one.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other thing that's comforting for me is recognizing that I am corrupt and that God still loves me and pursues me and rectifies my own corruption into to healing. Mm-hmm. And that no matter how far down a road I go, I always know that He's going to pull me out of the mud, clean me up, and bring me back in the house.
Yeah.
And that gave me a lot of, because at first I had a lot of fear of that, but when I recognized that redemption layer, that fear went away because it's like, oh, it doesn't matter if I go down this road, this alley, or this road. I know God is going to pursue me.
Yeah, and it brings in that want to do better.
Yeah.
And it's not. I mean, for me, especially early on, it was a willpower-based want.
Yeah.
Like I'm gonna do whatever.
Yeah, that's
it
a
takes.
good point. Yeah, I'm going to do it versus letting God do it through me and participating with Him.
But I think in the last few years, like it becomes, and I wish it would be spoken of more in the church, especially when you're about to accept the reality of when you count the cost and decide to take on that cost, that you're not just committing to willpower, you're committing to, hey, whenever you go down this path, have a real conversation with God. Mm-hmm. And that's something we're also not used to in America. Mm-hmm. Having that vulnerable, sincere, man, this is painful. This is not easy.
Yeah, it's hard.
And, even being angry with God.
Yeah.
You're taught to be afraid of God, not be angry with Him. But in real relationship, you have to have some degree of anger. Especially if you think about marriage, right? Mm-hmm. Like, you're married to God. you're going to get angry with God too,
Yeah.
not just your spouse.
Well, I think God invites us to direct our emotions to Him first.
Yeah.
So our anger, lay it upon Christ, who went to the cross to receive that anger. And it could be anything. It could be grief, anger, frustration, doubt. He's let Him absorb the crux of it. And then, some of that emotion may need to be shared with other people, but particularly anger and contempt, like throw that on Christ. That's what He has invited us to do.
All right, so we'll get back to Beatitude.
Yeah, so I want to give another example.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
That I think ties into what you're saying. But the blessed are the poor in spirit, for they will inherit the kingdom of God. So the thing to think about is when you become poor in spirit, which will require the work of God in you, in us, we will inherit the kingdom of God. And the kingdom of God is not material, the material blessings, although sometimes that can be part of it. Sometimes it can be, we could be spiritually wealthy while being materially poor.
Yeah.
So you have to keep that in mind. So the other, you mentioned, I think, gratitude, and we talked about entitlement. So there's a recent example that I think is a good contrast between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. One of the striking things that I've seen about Kamala Harris is because I've been watching a lot of her speeches and just seeing the events she's doing. At the beginning of the speeches, she will spend like 5-10 minutes just thanking people. This intense sense of gratitude. And I think that gratitude is an example of the poor in spirit because it acknowledges that it's not about me. I couldn't do this by myself. I needed help. I wouldn't have gotten where I am with others. And so I found that so striking. One, because I just value gratitude so much myself. And I think it's super important, especially when we're feeling bitter or contemptuous. Gratitude is one antidote to help us go, okay, get us out of that entitlement trap, which we can fall into and I fall into. So that was interesting. Well, Donald Trump came out and he ended up mocking her about all this gratitude that she's saying. It's almost like he either doesn't understand it or he just is kind of talking down to her. But he's like, she just keeps saying thank you. Like, what's wrong? There's something wrong with her. Why is she doing that? And Trump is a very prideful person, and I can't think of. I'm sure he's thanked people before, but I can't think of it. It's not prominent enough for me to notice it, since it tends to be more grievance and what is owed to him versus him expressing gratitude for others. So that was a striking contrast just between the two candidates, and I think that ties into the idea of the poor in spirit.
It makes me think of a couple different things. He said this jokingly, but he should really not have. He mentioned at one point, all I care about is your vote, to his audience. That is not a poverty of spirit or poor in spirit type comment, even if it is joking, because it's acknowledging that the audience is essentially like puppets. They're just
it's a transactional relationship.
Temporarily, yes.
Yeah.
And also,
if you give me your vote, you're in my goodwill, but if not, then I don't really care about you. Is that kind of what you mean? Okay.
And it makes me think of another thing. He kind of garbled that Christians don't have to vote again after this last time.
Yeah.
As if implying that Christians are above other religions or atheists even, which is highly against God.
Yeah.
They're all His children. So to have preference and even to do something illegal like that is highly against God's spirit.
Well, and it implies a few things. The most generous reading of that is a selfishness. Because after this election, I can't run again, so you won't have to vote again, because this is a transaction, right? So I don't care if you vote ever again. I just need you to vote for me because it's the next election. So that's the most generous take. I think it can be much more horrifying in the ramifications if you sort of take it to its logical ends and you look at historical leaders that have done that. But it's very much about him and what he's getting and what people are giving him, and not about what we're giving to others. Mm-hmm. And so, am I serving and loving other people, or am I being served and being entitled or expecting to be loved by other people?
Yeah, and going above and beyond to care for others, which makes me think of the opposite contrast. Kamala, as a prosecutor, could have settled for $6 billion for homeowners that got defrauded, but she actually pushed hard and got $20 billion for them.
Yeah. And another thing too, I mean, from just the gratitude, but also just the poor in spirit, like there's just a lot of stories that Kamala Harris has shared about her mother and her family, and just them imbuing in her a sense of gratitude and humility and appreciation for what others have contributed to her, that she's not an island, that she's a makeup of all these people that have poured out their lives to them, and so that's the type of the spirit, I think, in a lot of ways of what we're talking about here, because when we are humble, when we are we'll get to the meek one, but when we're meek, when we have that sense of dependence on God and that independence, that's when God does bless us in those, and it may not look the way we expect, but it does come.
Yeah, and she said also, "I need your help," literally. She acknowledges the things she wants to make happen in Congress and the Senate. She can't do on her own, and so asking literally of her audience, this is a combined effort, not just me
together.
I'm going to deliver you on my
own. This is about us and what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. And even, at the DNC convention, Barack Obama's speech, he had a segment where he just, if poor in spirit is one side and then superiority is on the other side, he really encouraged the Democrats at the convention and everyone watching to listen to their rivals, to listen to those that don't agree with them, and to realize that we're not better than them, that they have something to share with us and to teach us, and we have something to learn from them, and just encouraging that humility. And so that was another, not just in who Harris is, but also the leadership of the party.
Yeah. So to go back to the opposite end for Trump, I read an article that stated one of the reasons that it was delayed also, that black journalist event where he was being interviewed, was because he was not wanting to be fact checked. Yeah. And so that produces another concern around, if he is truly humble, he would want to know what he's saying is wrong and address it directly versus actively stave it off.
Yeah, if he cared about the truth, then, for me, who's someone who wants to be accountable, and assuming it's a good faith conversation, that we should invite accountability if we're Christians, even if we don't like it, which sometimes we don't.
Yeah. So let's address probably what's number one for most stricter Christians that don't necessarily look at the full picture. Let's address the abortion topic for both ends of the equation. Even though Trump is starting to become a lot more liberal with his language about it because he realizes it's losing him votes, so he's kind of, shuffling to what the people, instead of standing to something. So, I actually had a conversation with one of your friends on Facebook the other day about this matter, and I mentioned how outside of COVID, the policies that Trump has put in place have killed over 400,000 Americans. And we've had this conversation numerous times. People think about abortion directly, but don't think about after the child is born, right?
We have a whole conversation episode that people can check out where we dive into that dynamic where if am I anti-abortion, where I just want to make it illegal and then wash my hands of it, because I've talked to a lot of friends and Republicans they just want to make it illegal, and then they've done their duty and they can move on.
Yeah, There's nothing else, even though there is many things else.
And then there's the reality of if you're actually pro-life, you have the whole child's life from conception to when they're 18, when they become an adult. And to be pro-life is to help them get to become an adult from the beginning to the end. And if you only care about the beginning, are you really pro-life? And that's, I think, a key question.
Yeah, and let's draw a literal example. If we have 100,000 Jeffrey Dahmers that are born from a mother or a father or both that doesn't want them, 100 Jeffrey Dahmers could kill a whole lot of tens of thousands of people, or maybe hundreds of thousands. It can multiply the issue. So now we're killing on another side of the equation.
Yeah, the thing I would say about that is, so that could be a possibility, is you have these babies that are born and then they are raised in a horrible situation, and then it's just a terrible life for them, and they create consequences for others.
Yeah.
I'd want to be careful to not go too far down that road, because it becomes a kind of a utilitarian argument of like it doesn't necessarily have to be an either or. It doesn't have to be, well, we vote, because this is what it's, from what I've seen since Trump has kind of embraced the abortion issue as his platform, and as I've seen people who have supported Trump, particularly if abortion was an issue, they're turning it into Harris is going to kill tens of millions of babies, even if Trump is only going to kill 1 million babies. So it's like 1 million versus 10 million, or whatever their number is.
Yeah.
So, which I find that whole conversation absurd. Yeah. There's kind of this famous idea of if you could go back in time and Hitler was a baby, like, would you kill the Hitler baby? And I think the failure of that idea is, well, you could actually go back, and to your point, just love the baby and give him a wonderful upbringing and care for him. You don't have to kill him to solve the problem. Yeah. Death is not the answer. And so that's kind of how I feel about this sort of new justification for Trump's abortion stance. But yeah, I think it is an issue. I think the first thing people who have supported Trump because of the abortion issue, I think in many ways they have to acknowledge a couple of things. One, that they've been manipulated. Yeah. And two, I think you have to get to a larger, more holistic picture of life and how to protect it, preserve it. And I believe we can actually eliminate abortion without making it illegal. Yeah. And I know Democrats who would happily partner with Republicans to solve the issues that cause people to get abortions without it being a conflict at all.
That brings up another big misconception, that all Democrats are super liberal. There's actually many conservative Democrats too. Yeah. And
just a spectrum of
And there are even Republicans that want to look at the full picture of the womb's tomb. Yeah. Not just the womb by itself. Like Mitt Romney wanted to pass laws to help support that.
Yeah, I think a lot of his plans would have prevented so many abortions just by doing that. Yeah. And that's the same with Harris. She has these, family, parental policies and ideas that will probably prevent abortions. Yeah. And it may prevent more abortions than making it illegal.
It'll probably prevent divorces too. Yeah. Because one of the top 3 factors of divorce is financial issues. Yeah. So if you're being drowned by financial issues and you're bringing along a child, this is going to keep on dividing families. Yeah. So it's a very complex matter, and so we shouldn't be focused on just one part of the equation.
Yeah, and I think part of the concern, kind of what we started at the beginning, was control, and we want to have control. And we want to take control, and we want to and when that gets to its extreme form, it's domination. I want to dominate you, and that is where we get unhealthy. And I think that's where a lot of these laws around abortion are. When I look at them, it feels more like trying to dominate people than it is about trying to preserve and protect life. Yeah, and
you also mentioned forcing people with anti-abortion laws doesn't actually stop.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the research, having it outlawed doesn't get rid of abortion. It just changes how it happens and where and when. with Mexico making abortion illegal, making it legal. And even if all the states outlawed it, people are going to go to Canada and Mexico.
So we're not solving the heart of the issue.
Yeah, but instead of chasing the laws in that way, we could actually proactively solve the problems.
Yeah.
But that's where, for me, I actually care about solving the problem, not just making it illegal. Now, people think making it illegal solves the problem, but it doesn't. And that could be just their ignorance, or maybe they actually don't have a pro-life ethic. And I think that's another thing we have to acknowledge, is a lot of their moral reasoning is secular and worldly, not Christian, even though they're against abortion.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. It's conservatism without the religion.
Yeah.
Okay, so how does that very delicate topic that a lot of people base their entire political party on relate to Kamala and Donald? For me, I would say Kamala is probably figuring out the full circle solution better than Donald, versus Donald is trying to force people into changing their hearts through law, which only makes people rebel more and continue to do the action. So that's kind of my thought. I don't think, basically in short, Kamala is probably doing a little bit better job than that.
Yeah, I mean, if you're afraid that someone's going to come into your house and dominate you, it's going to create a reaction.
Yeah.
And so I think even if you wanted to regulate abortion, which I think most people want, even in the Democratic side, they don't want willy-nilly more abortions. Mm-hmm. If you steel man their argument, now there may be some that are like will go far, but there's also a quarter of Republicans that also are in favor of abortion. So it's not a one or the other kind of thing.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I think Trump, because of just his deception and his bad character and his domination approach, he pushes people that might be receptive to pro-life arguments. I think he pushes them away unnecessarily and loses the hearts and minds battle. And then there's a hypocrisy issue as well. When you're a hypocrite and then you're trying to tell other people to live a certain way, you're not gonna win their hearts and minds. So you lose moral authority.
Yeah.
So I think in the long run, I actually think that for me, I believe choosing Trump is choosing more abortions in the long run, because it's more about domination and control, more about trying to make things illegal and not trying to solve the actual problems. And this gets to the poor in spirit, which is, I think it's just a prideful way to approach it, and not lacking in appreciation and humility that it's complex and there are a lot of layers and people are coming from it from different angles.
Yeah.
And you're trying to bring everyone together. And then also, with Kamala Harris, there probably are going to be some differences in how I'm going to disagree with her on this issue.
Yeah.
But at the same time, then she has these policies that will likely prevent abortions through these family programs.
Yeah.
And so you kind of have to juggle that. Her argument is that we should let women make the choice. She's not necessarily saying that she wants people to get an abortion, but she's saying let them make the choice. And so then you have the conversation, and this is essentially the shift that Trump's made, is, well, do you let the states and then ultimately the individuals make these decisions, and how much do you regulate through the government versus letting the individual choose?
Yeah.
So you have a lot of other issues that are tangled into it that are unrelated to the actual issue itself.
Yeah.
So
it brings up an even bigger issue. Does God even want Christian beliefs to be permeated through government too?
Yeah, so that's another question. All these different kind of tangential questions. I think as Christians we should push for systems and laws that encourage good and truthful things.
Yeah.
And so, but we have to be shrewd and wise in navigating that, because we can also make things a lot worse. And I think that's what we've done. As a Republican Party, we've made things worse on the abortion front. And I think we're going into debt in our society and winning hearts and minds because we've gotten it so wrong.
Yeah.
We haven't demonstrated love. if I, as a friend, if I demonstrate to you love and then I share something with you that's difficult, we have this relational equity to kind of work through that. But if I'm trying to control and dominate you, and then I try and tell you the truth, you're just probably not going to listen.
Yeah.
So.
Wow, so we covered a whole lot in that episode. Well, maybe we'll do a little bit more in this episode, but blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. As we wrap up this point, I want to mention another reason that we're doing this is that people, for the most part, are followers. And if they are following somebody that acknowledges that they are poor in spirit, that they are real with themselves, that they're in humility, that is more like Jesus, and therefore, hopefully, will have more of hearts changed, and maybe even more people brought back into Christianity to understand the real love that he brings, not the forced, I'm going to tell you what to do.
And that's the power, like the early church in the cruel Roman Empire. This little band of misfits called Christians turned it upside down.
Yeah.
And they had no power, they had no control, they had nothing. And they inherited the kingdom of God because they were poor in spirit, and God worked through them in amazing, miraculous ways. And I think that's where we need to get to as a church, because ultimately my fear is that Christians have squandered their moral high ground, their moral authority. They've squandered their influence and power, and the cost is our Christian witness, and sharing the good news about God with other people is most important. And yet we've kind of made it a negligible issue that's in order to win, or in order to have power, in order to whatever it is that each individual in the collective wanted. We got those things, and it cost us our souls.
Yeah. Another great, well, maybe not great, but a spearheaded talking point by the Trump and his party, because I don't even think it's GOP anymore. I think it's the Trump party now. Is that they love to say it's the liberal agenda, it's the socialist agenda. The funny thing is, a good friend of us, again, Matt, brought up, I'm not even sure what I should follow right now, because when I look at the book of Acts, they were essentially socialists.
Yeah.
They were living in a community together, sharing everything, selling their property, and sharing the distributions. And I was like, wow, what a poor in spirit Beatitude way to look at it.
Yeah.
Because if you look at it from an American perspective, I'm going to win. I'm going to take this capitalism thing to where I'm a trillionaire. I'm going to crush anybody along the way. And I just thought that was very wise of him to say.
Yeah. Well, and I think the a core layer of that is, and I think what we're also saying here is, we could be wrong about everything we're saying here. Like we could be missing something big.
Yeah.
We could be misguided. That's accepting our own fallibility is part of this. And I think the other part of that goes the other way, which is when I'm representing my political rivals, I'm a Republican and I'm representing a Democrat, or vice versa, am I representing them fairly, generously, accurately? Am I making what's called a steel man argument, like a strong argument? Or am I making a straw man, which is like the weakest version of their argument, so that I can pummel their argument, kind of have that sense of superiority, like my argument's way better than theirs, because I'm attacking their weak argument. But what we need to do is ask ourselves, when I'm talking about my rivals or my political adversaries, am I representing them the way I would want them to represent me? And I think there's a lot of caricatures and a lot of manipulation that happens. And so I think that's a big part of the issue, is that people don't see their rivals. They see a caricature of their rivals that their allies who hate their rivals have told them, which may or may not be true. And so I think having the humility to recognize that I could be wrong, but the people that are talking to me could be wrong, or my conception of of the situation or of reality may be inconsistent with reality itself. It may be an illusion.
Yeah. And it makes me think of, it could also just be a circumstance that they're used to. Like, if you grew up with a abusive father, you're either going to like, or were forced to like and be accepting of who they were, or you're going to be totally repulsed by them and want to walk away. I think there's a sect of people here that are just accepting Trump because they're kind of used to that person in their lives too.
Yeah, when we tolerate that locally, we will tolerate it nationally. Sometimes it can go the other way. I think what people fail to realize is, if all this toleration of all of Trump's sinful, wrong behavior, that's how abuse happens in local contexts, at churches, at schools, at community centers, at school, with friends, or, at businesses. When we tolerate these behaviors, sometimes it's just bad behavior and it's sort of within a realm of sort of normality, but sometimes it can lead to like physical or sexual abuse or other types of theft and fraud. And so if we can't navigate this healthily nationally, we probably not handling it good in our local area. If I'm going to allow someone to do something wrong, that's my president, what's to stop me from letting an employee do something wrong they shouldn't be doing? Or
my manager.
Yeah.
Where I may not even be able to address that.
Yeah.
And to wrap up this section, I mean, it's pretty clear who I'm forward to, maybe even clear for you. But when I have spoken to people that support Trump, a very close friend of ours, I really love the guy, and he's a very loving Christian. But when I brought up the situation around, this is a divorced man that spews hatred, divisiveness, he even has discussed incest, like he could be with his daughter. What else has he done that are against pretty much all the 10 Commandments?
Yeah, I mean, he's exploited people essentially his whole life in every possible way that you can.
Taking inheritances away from his own.
I mean, take the 7 deadly sins, and he's pretty much violated all of them over and over again.
So when I brought that up to not even just that friend, but others, it becomes kind of a detour. It becomes, they almost kind of sound like a news anchor. Like, let me just try to detour from all of that. Because this justifies it.
Yeah.
For all that, there's the abortion. He's salvaged. He's my savior for abortion, and that's going to save so many others. When not looking at the longer term picture, this person that is leading all these sins with almost a sense of pride is going to allow other people to say,
to mimic.
Yeah, that's what he's done. I could do it too. To my wife, I could divorce my wife tomorrow. He divorced 3 times, and so that's another thing that I think is not spoken of enough is there's many sheep. Let's be real. There's many sheep in our country and the world. If they see a leader doing something and it's okay, abuse, been convicted of sexual
normalizing
assault, then what's to stop millions, hundreds of millions from others of doing that? And that's even more dangerous, that alone, than any other policy, because people could just follow that and multiply exponentially sin.
Yeah, I mean, look at, as an extension of that, when you look at Trump in 2020, all of his mass deception about the election before the election, and then his mass deception after it, and then his attempt to consolidate state and congressional power so they could overturn the election, and then that resulted in January 6th. If we elect him again, we are saying those things are all okay and that we want them to happen again. And it may be him that does them again, or it could be the next person or the next presidential candidate.
We've already seen it in other countries where far-right leaders did the same approach. Sadly, in some cases, it actually worked.
Yeah.
They were actually forcibly taking over the country. So now we're talking about sheep in leadership capacities taking the same fold.
The other thing that happens is when we enable those, because those people, those corrupt leaders, they only are able to be successful because they have enablers. And when we enable them, we corrode our moral compass. And when we corrode our moral compass, we get rid of all the resources we need to do what's true and right. And we become more entrenched in the corruption ourselves. We become more like Pharaoh, the tyrant, that God liberates the Israelites from. Mm-hmm. And so, so normalizing that behavior, and then saying, what we're saying is the things trump, if we are as a society saying these things are acceptable to us. They're not. I have this idea called roadblocks and potholes. A roadblock is something that it's a no. There's no way around it. It's a stopper. A pothole is, that's not good, but we can drive over it and move on. And I think essentially what we're saying is all the things Trump has done, they're just potholes. They're not ideal. Maybe I don't support them. Maybe some people do. But you know what? They're not worth saying never to this guy. And I think that's highly problematic. And I think this maybe gets to the poor in spirit, maybe as an idea is, I think for a lot of people, they might think, I couldn't vote for a Democrat, like as a Republican. Mm-hmm. So I'm a Republican who's voted for a Democrat multiple times because of Trump. Mm-hmm. And but there's a pride thing there's a weird thing even for me to go outside of my tribe like that. And I think it's some kind of a pride thing that says that I would need my rival to help me. Mm. That's the last thing I want. Which is interesting because that's really the story of the Good Samaritan. Mm. You know, it's this guy who's helping his enemy or his rival. And for me as a Republican to ask my enemy to help me, man, you got to be poor in spirit to do that. and so I don't know if that answers your question, but that's a few things that come to mind.
That's a good point. And then it brings up political idolatry, which is I voted Republican for 40 years, and that's all I know. And so, if you're a true Christian, that's not an option. Mm-hmm. There's no loyalty to anything except God.
Yeah. And I think that's a good way to think about it, is my loyalty to God first, and then I'm going to support the party when it does good things, and I'm not going to support it when it doesn't do good things. And I'm going to support this party when it does good things. And this is one of the things, particularly about the abortion issue, is if we have a holistic view of life, we have to come to the realization that we actually need Democrats and Republicans to solve the whole picture. Because some of them have solutions for part of it, and others have solutions for other parts of it. And so we need the whole picture to actually solve the problem, and we need to work together to do that. Yeah. And it's going to have to be bipartisan. And we're going to have to probably make compromises because no one's going to agree on everything. Yeah. But I think we have to have enough humility to realize that.
Yeah. A few days ago we talked about this, and we could be on the verge of a flipping of the parties again. Mm-hmm. Like the Republicans love to reflect on Abraham Lincoln. Yeah. But the Republicans during Abraham Lincoln's time would be looked at as liberal today. Mm-hmm. And so it just really reiterates the reason, like, party doesn't really mean much. It's the execution of God's will, mm-hmm. if we so desire it as a nation, because God doesn't want to force people either.
And I think that's part of the issue is that there's a superficial layer. There's the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And those are superficial evaluations mm-hmm. of a group. But you have to look underneath it. And so I'll give you an example. Bush famously made this comment about Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia. He was wearing a cross. And he said, "Oh, he's wearing a cross. That's a man I can get. That's a man I can get that I can work with." Mm. He took this superficial symbol, kind of assumed, "Oh, this is a Christian guy that believes good things, and he can work with them." and he's like one of the most corrupt men in our world right now.
Yeah.
So you have to kind of look at what's underneath the surface, and I think with the Republican Party, historically they have had Reagan was famous, but even he had his own corruption with the Iran-Contra scandals and whatnot, and you had Nixon before that. But even in the positive light for Reagan, that we're not that party.
Too.
But
he seems to have worked across the aisle.
Yeah, yeah, and he even famously says he didn't leave the Democratic Party; they left him.
Mm.
But that's kind of what's happened. That's how I feel. Is the Republican? I never left the Republican Party; they left me because they abandoned their principles and pursued power and compromised with corruption.
Yeah.
And not everyone that as a Christian, our salvation is not dictated by who we vote for. So whether you vote for one person or the other doesn't mean you're not a Christian anymore, because our salvation is based on what Christ did for us, not what we did. And so it doesn't mean we can't make the wrong decision or that we can't both. I just want to emphasize that's a separate issue. As Christians, I think we're called in a certain direction towards truth and goodness, and so we should move towards that. And so I have a large issue if someone chooses to support and vote for Trump. But at the end of the day, that doesn't mean they're not a Christian.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So we just covered a whole lot. We could go further, but I'm going to stop here for this particular section.